So, Dr. Bhavani, do you want to just briefly introduce Ms. Namboodiri again?
Kripa, go ahead, Kripa. In a place where there will be a lot of ambient sound.
Okay. So we have again with us Ms. Namboodiri. She spoke with us about 2 weeks ago on the on elephants and human-animal conflict. She is going to be speaking with us today about sacred groves and snakes, which is really opportune because it is World Snake Day tomorrow, I believe. And we're very excited to have her back. Thank you so much for joining us again. And I will let you just start. I think you're still muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. So thank you, and I'm happy to be back again. Thanks again to Dr. Bhavani, Dr. Rao, and everybody else who's been involved in organizing this program. Thank you again. So I was asked to talk about the tradition of sacred groves that has been existing in India and many parts of the world. Just to tell you how this happened was I was having a conversation with Dr. Bhavani and several other members of the group of the AMMACHI Labs. This was regarding a discussion we were having about the human-elephant conflict issues in the Dhenkanal area, in the project area. And randomly the subject diverted to my personal background and my personal association with the sacred grove tradition, or the tradition of serpent worship, Naga Aradhana as we call it in India. And then it was just a random conversation. I was just telling her my background, and Dr. Bhavani, became very interested in the subject. So that was how, and then she immediately asked me if I would be interested in speaking about this. And of course, it was more, I considered it as an opportunity for me to do a lot more research and to do a bit of introspection as well while preparing for the subject. So, so preparing for today's topic was more of an introspective as well as a therapeutic process for me, looking back at my early association with this tradition. So I have talked about the subject several times about sacred groves because of my background with conservation and with biology. So I have spoken about sacred groves from an ecological perspective. I have seen them from that perspective, but there's also been several other dimensions that have opened up as a part of my journey with understanding the environmental value, the ecological value of sacred groves. And to be able to combine, to synthesize all these various dimensions into today's topic was indeed something very, very, very special to me. Now, my personal association with the serpent or the sacred grove tradition of Kerala comes from my marriage with my husband. He is from such a traditional family of Kerala. And I have been part of this family, this tradition for the last 20 years. So before we actually get into the subject, I also wanted to just outline a bit, or give an outline about what are the different aspects I would be touching upon. So when you talk about sacred groves, you cannot, some of the things that have to be considered or discussed are the tradition of worshipping serpents, the matriarchal system that is associated with such traditions. And there are also, of course, there are the ecological aspects of this socio-cultural dimension. But there's also an esoteric component, what we could call the spiritual element that is associated with such a system, with such traditions. So I will try to touch upon all these dimensions as in as coherent a manner as possible, and hope to make some kind of a sense. So, so basically, I would like to start off by touching upon what exactly the Sarpa tradition means, generically what the Sarpa tradition is about. So as most of us know and are aware, that worship of serpents is one of the oldest and the most widespread forms of worship all over the world. It's a universal phenomena, or a universal kind of a system that has been existing. And the English word serpent is derived obviously from the Latin word serpens, which means a crawling animal like a snake. And in Sanskrit, of course, it's known as the Sarpa. And as we all know, there is this connect between these ancient languages, these old languages. The connection between Latin and Sanskrit has always been discussed about. It's been studied. So I am not going into such areas. So the Sarpa, or the serpent, have been associated with some of the oldest rituals known to mankind. And it is associated with a lot of, it's part of a lot of mythology, folklore, symbolisms. So the serpent basically has a lot of associations, symbolic associations with it. And I personally, for one, have been very much fascinated with the study of symbolicism of, especially with the natural world, because of my personal bias towards the natural world, towards conservation, towards animals. So I particularly have been very fascinated in trying to understand animal symbology and totems, the use of animal totems in various cultures, what they represent. So being a nature lover and who had a career as an activist, I've been an advocate of animal rights and conservation for a very long time. So it was only natural for me to explore the cultural history in association with the natural world. So most of this symbology was based on the biological and behavioral adaptations of these animals. As I started trying to understand these symbologies, that was what that was what made sense. It wasn't just some random symbolic explanations that were there. They were all based on certain factual biological behavioral adaptations. Now, with snakes, the symbolism of snakes has a long history with the indigenous spiritual and cultural practices. And it's interesting to see how these symbolisms originated or became adopted by the people throughout the various histories. So I guess humans have had to coexist with snakes for a very long time, and they're present in almost every part of the world. So they have been part of people's lives. So it's natural that they dominate, that they are present in most of cultural and traditional associations, and in the fabricating of myths and legends. Snakes and serpents have a very significant role there. So, but another interesting thing is that what some of these symbologies sometimes seem very antagonistic to each other. What has one meaning in one part of the world, in another part of the world, it probably has a completely different or an opposite meaning. So in most of the Abrahamical traditions, if you look at them, there is a kind of a negative association with the serpent. For instance, snakes are considered as evil and deceitful. They're also associated with treachery, sin, a lot of dark associations with it: death, fear, destruction, deceit. These are some of the darker associations with the serpent construct or association, symbology. There's also serpents are also associated with power, with fertility, with progeny. Power, I think it's more because of its ability to strike fear. The fear, of course, is a very dominant force, and any kind of power is always, in most situations, power is connected with fear, the ability to strike fear. So I guess serpents are associated with power for that reason. And then, of course, there's fertility and progeny. Historically, serpents and snakes, if you look at them, they represent fertility and a certain life force. Snakes are, I guess, probably some of it comes from a biological reason as well, because snakes are one of this group of animals that can reproduce asexually without a male. So like some species of snakes, like the flower pot snake is one example where it can produce young ones through a process called parthenogenesis. So probably that could be one. Probably this is the biologist in me that is trying to look for that explanation. However, what I wanted to put forward was they have also been associated with fertility and with creation. And then there's this association with transformation. Snakes, because they are known to shed their skin, it's kind of symbolic with rebirth and a change. So transformation is one very powerful symbology. Then guardianship. Snakes have always, if we are familiar with most of our mythological stories, serpents have been represented as very powerful guardians of temples, treasure, sacred spaces. And it probably stems from the observation that when threatened, the behavior that some snake species exhibit. So like, for instance, rattlesnakes and cobras, they're very persistent where in the face of threat. When they're attacked, they hold their ground. Rather than fleeing away, they hold their ground, they stand and fight back. They are aggressive rather than retreating. So probably that kind of a behavior led to this association of guardianship with serpents. And then there's also this symbology of health and healing. Snakes have been associated with healing, which is evident from the staff of caduceus, which is a symbol of modern medicine. Snakes are also associated with sexual desire, with sexuality. So these are some of the most common symbologies that have been documented or have been observed with relation to serpent worship. And then, of course, we have this, in India, this is a very strongly prevalent culture, strongly prevalent tradition. Though in many other parts of the world, this tradition has kind of become reduced to a few minor communities practicing it. So major practice of the Sarpa tradition or Sarpa worship, the serpent worship, is more common in India, I would say, and even more so in the south of India, particularly in the state of Kerala, where I am from. So the serpents are also called Nagas in the Indian tradition, and the Nagas are believed to be divine, semi-divine deities, or a semi-divine race of half-human serpents, and they are considered to dwell in the underworld, which we call the Patala, and they have the powers to take human forms, and not any form that they wish to take. And there are also several associated legends and myths woven around this Naga story, the Naga narrative. there's the concept of Ashtanagas. There are 8 divine Nagas, of which there are some very prominent Nagas called the Vasuki and Ananta. They're all, our mythology, our Puranas are replete with stories of Nagas. So most of us who are familiar with these texts and literary pieces of bodies of work would be familiar with these names. And most of there are a lot of rituals associated with worship of Nagas. And most of these rituals involve certain practices particularly in Kerala, if you see the kind of ritual practices that are seen, they are mostly very aesthetic and involve a synthesis of the performing arts. They're very sensual, I would say, most of these rituals. They are, in the sense it engages all of your senses. It's a visual treat. The music, it's very magical. It's very meditative, and the whole presence. These rituals are designed in such a way to engage your entire conscious or awareness, and the Indian mythology also talks a bit about the origin of the snakes. The snakes or the Nagas originally are considered to be descendants from 2 very special spiritual people, the rishis, as we call them, the Kashyapa and Kadru. So they are considered to be like your, like you have the Adam and Eve in the biblical tradition. Kashyapa and Kadru are considered to be the people who are the 2 human, or the 2 couples who have procreated the whole generation of Nagas. I hope, it's difficult not to engage upon the subject without touching upon the mythology and the various rituals. However, I will try to keep it as least boring as possible, because these rituals are very elaborate, and I would like to focus more on the essence or the spirit of this whole tradition rather than the actual practices of what is really happening. And my other concern is because I had some issues with my slides, I wasn't able to upload them. So I wanted to actually, so it would be meaningless to keep talking about these rituals without having any visual aid. So I would just like to skip over all those details regarding the rituals and mythology. And so like I was saying, there are a lot of elaborate rituals and a lot of traditions that continue to be practiced in many of the parts of India with related to Sarpa worship, Naga worship. And in Kerala, and because I'm personally very much closer and I'm more familiar with the traditions in Kerala, I would be speaking more in detail or more in the context of Kerala. So in Kerala, the tradition of Naga worship has been recorded historically to be at least a few centuries ago, at least 600 to 700 centuries back. And it's very, and compared to the serpent or the Naga worship in other parts of India, in Kerala, this is almost like it's a part of every individual or a family's day-to-day life. In most of the other traditions, it's a common, like the village would have its one common Sarpa worship center or a temple or maybe a grove, and it would be like a common kind of space. But in Kerala, it is something very unique in the sense each household has its own tradition of worshipping the Sarpa. And how are these Sarpas or these serpents worshipped, the Nagas, how are they worshipped? So the sacred groves, which is basically the key discussion of this talk. The sacred groves basically were considered as habitats or spaces where these entities dwelled. So it could be both the physical snake as well as the abstract or the conceptual, the spiritual snake, Sarpa, that is being worshipped in such spaces. So these, in Kerala, we call these sacred groves as kavus. So kavu basically consists of a large tract of land. Because if those of you who are not familiar with the landscape of Kerala or the geographical or administrative land revenue system of Kerala, I would like to just tell you briefly that Kerala primarily is an agrarian society, and large tracts of land are left wild. If somebody owns like 1 acre or 15 acres of land, a certain percentage, say 2 to 3% of that land would be left wild, meaning it will not be cultivated or used for any commercial purposes. And that particular land is left to run wild. There is no human interference. It's almost like a little forest, like a grove. And the Sarpa, the snake gods, are, and most of them have these little idols of the snake gods there. And there are certain rituals which are performed on a daily or sometimes even a monthly or an annual basis. And these pieces of land are considered sacred. So nobody enters these lands unnecessarily. Cattle are not allowed to be grazed. You're not even allowed to chop off any kind of, even if the wood is dead, you're not allowed to take away the dead tree from the sacred grove, nor are you allowed to collect any produce from, for instance, if there are beehives or even collecting firewood, none of that is allowed or encouraged. So this is the concept of a sacred grove. So from a conservation point of view, this is like an excellent piece of land. This is the best way of conserving a piece of land. Because this is exactly what we are taught when we are studying conservation biology. How should a forest be preserved? How should one associate? What should be the interaction with the forest, and how do you leave a piece of land undisturbed? So this is the sort of a thing. There's very minimal human interaction there, and most of the time you are to leave it undisturbed. And there are also some very interesting, traditions or rituals that have evolved over time, which at one point, or to most people, would seem like senseless. But then when you try to look at the logic behind it, it makes sense. There's a strong tradition, there's a strong belief system that says you're not supposed to approach the kavu post sunset, even any time after, in the afternoon, past your lunchtime, or any time after 3 p.m. Usually people are discouraged from going into such sacred groves, or even anywhere in the perimeter of such areas. Now, it makes sense in those days, because generally before electricity became popular, before it was invented, people always had a strong connection of, had this strong system. It was part of our lives to orient everything around daylight. Darkness was not something you were comfortable with. So always nocturnal activities were restricted or minimized. But this also has this particular tradition has a ecological angle to it. There's an ecological sense to it, because there are many nocturnal species who are in our neighborhoods, especially in a tropical country like ours. There are many species which complete their life cycle or engage in their daily cycle nocturnally. So any kind of a human presence or any kind of an interference is going to disturb and upset their life cycle. So probably that was another reason for why any kind of interference or movement or any kind of activity post sunset or post afternoon was strongly, established, entrenched into the belief system. So this is just one of the things that I found interesting, which I wanted to bring out as an example of how traditions practice the principle of conservation. To tell you a bit about the historical connection Kerala had with the Sarpa tradition. So there's a folk narrative which is about how Kerala, the state of Kerala, was created. As most of you who are familiar with Kerala geographically, ours is a small piece of land on the coast of the Arabian Sea. And it's a very fragile bit of land. It's a very significant, environmentally, ecologically significant piece of land. The people who live here are also considered quite interesting for several reasons. As a socio-cultural, environmentally, the people of Kerala are considered to be quite progressive in that sense. Anyway, so there's a very interesting story about how the state of Kerala was created. So the story goes that there's sage who was called Parashurama, and he was approached by certain Brahmins, the upper caste Hindus, and they wanted some piece of land to live because they were looking to migrate for many reasons. So they were looking for a piece of land. And Parashurama, on the other hand, was also himself kind of in a position where he was grieving, and he was, full of remorse for something he had done to the Kshatriyas, or the various Kshatriyas are the warrior race, and Parashurama had some personal issues with the Kshatriyas, and he had to kill, as a part of his personal vendetta, he had to kill several Kshatriya kings. So in order to make up for, to assuage his guilt, he decided to help the Brahmins. So, so he decided to donate a piece of land to the Brahmins. And it's said that he reclaimed the land from the whole part of Kerala. The bit of Kerala was actually under the sea, and it is said that Parashurama reclaimed the land from the sea. And when the land was reclaimed, he wanted to donate it to these upper class Brahmins. But then they found out that this area was full of, it was wild, uninhabitable, because there were a lot of poisonous snakes around. So the Brahmins were finding it very difficult to stay there. So they wanted a solution. So Parashurama decided to kind of make a treaty with the Serpents that were already inhabiting these areas and the Brahmins. So there was a kind of a pact.
I think her video is frozen. I'm not able to hear anything also.
It's paused for me. So it's not it's not just paused for me, it's even just the screen without our face. See from her.
Kripa, can you maybe call her and see just let her know that she's not visible anymore? Or Kripa, are you you touching base with her, or Nandita? Is anybody touching base with her?
No, sure, Dr. Bhavani. I don't have her contact. Maybe Kripa can help with it. Kripa, are you able to hear us? I can't see her also. Let me see.
Yeah, I'm also not
Dr.
able to-
Bhavani, would you
I'm just going to
send
check if I
her,
have
me her contact?
I
yeah.
don't have it.
If you
I
send me her
also
contact,
I don't have it, Nandita. Yeah.
Don't have it. Okay. Anyone in the plenum, Chris, don't have it too, I guess.
So let me see what
He
happened
shared
to
the link,
Kripa.
but
Maybe Kartika has it, or
I'll
actually
do that.
Sharon and Vidya may have it also.
yeah. So let me reach out to them.
I hope you can hear me now. I think we had.
Oh yeah, no, I think I found the number. Oh yes, now she's back on.
I'm
Okay,
sorry
perfect.
about that. We had a glitch here.
Wonderful.
We've been having issues for some time. Yeah, so I hope we will continue to have better signal here. Anyway, so coming back to where we were disrupted. So I was telling you about this parallel historical narrative, which is very close to very closely woven with the mythological tradition of the Kerala Ulpatti, we call it, the origin of the state of Kerala, the landmass of Kerala. So the historians say that there was actually a warrior race who were called Nayars. So the Nayars is a community which still continues to exist in Kerala. And they were primarily considered as the Kshatriyas, or people who were associated with wars and with protecting the state. So the historians think that the Naga tradition was something which was followed by the Nayar community, which was originally an endemic community of this landmass of Kerala. And then the migrant upper caste Brahmins who migrated to this part of Kerala had come to some kind of an understanding with this endemic indigenous community. And at some point in history, both the traditions, the cultural as well as the other traditions, kind of were synthesized to become one larger narrative. So that is the story of how, and since then, the Naga tradition, the tradition of worshipping Sarpas has been very prevalent, strongly prevalent in Kerala. And so it doesn't matter which narrative you like to accept, whether you would prefer to go by the myths or whether you would prefer the more historical narrative. What I found very interesting was the premise for both these narratives was that of coexistence. So it was on this fundamental premise of coexistence, coexisting with one another, with various communities who were very diverse in many ways, and also coexisting with the natural world, with your environment. So I felt that that was a very strong and very significant premise, and it is on this premise that most of our social and religious traditions have evolved. Everything has been built up on that fundamental premise. So the Sarpa tradition, like I was telling you, there are a lot of interesting rituals which have been documented and which have been studied by a lot of anthropologists and scholars, and even if you come to Kerala now, you would be able to see them being practiced as a part of every household. And another part of such a tradition is that there are certain upper caste Brahmin families who are ordained to perform, or who are kind of granted the custodianship over these ritualistic practices associated with the Sarpa worship. And it is these upper caste Brahmin communities that actually initiate or lead the rituals that are part of the traditions. So about and also about the kavus, the sacred groves. I was telling you about their ecological significance, how certain cultural traditions were evolved around these sacred groves. As now sacred groves are considered to be, from an ecological perspective, they are considered to be biological hotspots. Even the UN has recognized, the IUCN also has recognized the significance of these sacred groves as microhabitats for several species, especially smaller species like reptiles and smaller mammals, birds, and also most of them have been considered to be storehouses of some very endemic species, both flora and fauna, both the plant world, the biological world, both the animals as well as the plant species. So that is one very significant aspect that needs to be known about these sacred groves. And another ecological or environmental role that these sacred groves play in a system, in a particular area, is that they are good reservoirs of water, because they are very good, excellent habitats, and because of the system that they have in place. There are most of the water bodies, the water table surrounding these sacred groves is generally optimal, and they also, because they're closely connected to the agrarian tradition of Kerala. Kerala, like I told you earlier, is primarily an agrarian society, and sacred groves play a significant role in ensuring the fertility of the soil in areas adjacent to these sacred groves, and the fertility of the soil of the fields, and also the soil in areas around its perimeter. And so another significant aspect of the Sarpa tradition is the role of women in all this. So at two levels, you can look at this at two levels. At the mundane level, you have the matriarchal system. As many of you who have done some kind of a research, or who have some understanding or familiar with are familiar with the Sarpa tradition, will realize that most of these families or rituals or traditions that are associated with the Sarpa worship are matriarchal, meaning the women preside over most of these rituals. Women have a very dominant role in these rituals, and it still continues to be so. It's still very prevalent. And most of, and another interesting thing, where if you correlate it with the historical aspects, the cultural history of the land, that most of the communities, particularly the Nair community, the community I was telling you about, they are predominantly matriarchal. So that is at the mundane level. And then in a spiritual and an esoteric level, the Nagas, or the for the nascent consciousness in an individual, what we call the Kundalini, or the dormant conscious energy that is present in every individual. And this Kundalini, or this nascent energy, is depicted as a feminine attribute, probably because of its association with creation, with nurturing, which are all considered feminine attributes, and which is now globally celebrated as the divine feminine. So, and this Kundalini Shakti, I'm sure most of you are familiar with what it is. It's basically depicted symbolically as a coiled serpent, which is coiled 3.5 times around the base of a person's spine. And it's said that the yogic traditions tell you that when this dormant energy or the serpent awakens, it is able to travel up your spine through your chakras and to reach your 7th chakra. And now there's a lot of metaphor used in our traditions and most of our texts, because the language used to explain the esoteric is mostly very aesthetic and also filled with metaphors. So it's very difficult to separate what is fact and what is metaphor. So, however, in the metaphorical language, this awakening of your consciousness, this awakening of your Kundalini is called your initiation, and that movement, the way its energy moves through your chakras and through your spine is considered to be, is believed or has been documented as a serpentine movement. So that is probably another association with why serpents are closely associated with the consciousness and the Kundalini. And this energy, finally, it is believed that it moves all the way up to your consciousness and unites with the universal consciousness, which is called the Shiva, or symbolized as Shiva. And this confluence or this union is often called as the Shiva and the union of Shiva and Shakti. In a aesthetic, literary language, in the language of poets, it's explained like, it's described as a love affair. It's like a consummating the ultimate divine marriage between the divine consciousness and the individual consciousness. So that is the esoteric level at which there's an involvement, or the role of women is seen at that level. And whether you like it or not, whether you accept it or not, astrology is a very strong reality and a shastra, as we call it traditionally, as well as a practice in the lives of people, not just in Kerala, but also in most of, not just rural, but also in urban, suburban India. So it's this is not going to be a debate on whether astrology, about the validity of astrology as a science or not. Putting all that aside, I'm just merely stating the facts, and this is the reality that is happening here. It is a very strong part of people's lives in India. And as a part of this astrological tradition, the planet Rahu it has been strongly associated with the Sarpa tradition. And now the Rahu, any issues related with Rahu, your maladies in a horoscope, if it is connected with Rahu, it is remedied by appeasing the serpent gods. Now, something very interesting about Rahu, another symbolism or connection of that Rahu has is with nature. And the primary dharma or the function of Rahu as a planet is to establish a balance with nature. Whenever there is an imbalance, whenever there is a lack of harmony of the individual with his immediate environment or the natural system, there is an imbalance of Rahu. So Rahu is there to ensure that you are, there is a certain give and take in an individual's life, that it is there to remind you to live a more sustainable life, to not exploit natural resources, to not waste resources, and also under-exploiting resources is also an imbalance of nature and undemocratic uses of your resource. For instance, if you tend to monopolize certain resources that basically should be shared with the community, all these result in a dosha, or what we call an imbalance of Rahu. So that's a different take. That's a different way of looking at astrology as such. And usually astrologers, in order to remedy these, they recommend certain ritualistic practices associated with the tantra or the mantra or certain yantras. These are all, I'm not going into details about these practices or these traditional systems because we don't have the time for that. Each is a separate world in itself. However, these are the conventional remedies that are usually prescribed by astrologers traditionally. However, there are other forms of remedies too, which are rather unconventional, which are normally not very common or popular or used by or discussed by astrologers. However, it is there. And some of the unorthodox astrologers usually recommend certain different kinds of alternatives to balancing your Rahu. And some of them constitute taking initiatives or associating, working closely with nature, trying to balance your actions with that of nature. And for instance, if something as simple as making a donation towards conserving or protecting snake habitats, egg of snakes, hatchlings, or planting fruit-bearing trees. There are a lot of wildlife initiatives that are dedicated to conservation of snake habitats and reptiles in general, or in protecting snakes. So sometimes astrologers recommend people who are willing to accept that kind of a remedy. Some astrologers recommend that, so I personally encourage the latter as well, because it's much more closer to my passion and my understanding and my association with the world. And so I have also had the good fortune to meet such astrologers and work with them and encourage such practices within the community. Now, I hope I have given a fairly decent and holistic representation of the Sarpa tradition. And I would now like to kind of contribute or to share my personal experiences and observations with this entire tradition, how I have been personally transformed, how I have perceived all these traditions that have been happening around me. I have been living for the last 20 years in Kerala as a part of a family, a Brahmin family, which is associated with, which is ordained, like I had explained earlier, which is ordained to be doing certain rituals associated with snake worship. And the tradition says this family has been doing this for the last 200, 300 years. I'm still trying to work out and figure out the genealogy and its antiquity. But that aside, for me, initially, I was overwhelmed with the beauty of the rituals, the aesthetics, the depth of meaning, and the potential that was there deep inside for creating harmony in a community in general. And for somebody who was born and brought up in the city and who grew up far away from all this, for somebody like me who valued sustainability, arts, and harmony, this was like a model thought process and a model way of life for all of our modern world's problems. And I was very excited to, during my initial years, to be experiencing all this firsthand. But with time, I kind of sobered down a bit. And though there are such powerful symbols, these symbols have, and these practices are so full of symbolism about subjects like nature conservation, gender equality. There is potential for personal growth, for a collective growth for the whole society as the society as a whole, and to transcend the limitation of form, and to transcend the various diversities that are there. Now, this thing about form is something which I have always been interested in. I think I will go into that at a later part of this talk. So with all this potential, with all this deeply, such deep value systems that are there associated with these traditions and rituals, what disappointed me was that I realized most of the people who came to visit, who came to worship the Sarpas, as well as people who were practicing, who were custodians of these traditions, were able only to embrace the symbolic part of it, meaning the rituals were preserved. They were preserved in a very in a pristine form, but they were like shells. The essence, the value systems, the practical, the potential of practical application of these thoughts, of these these value systems, all that was ignored and abandoned, and people were hanging on only to the rituals, the ritualistic part of it. And then the most interesting thing that I found, that I experienced was this innate fear or revulsion to snakes. See, we have been, we're all familiar with how ancient this tradition of worshipping snakes is, and with such powerful symbolism, and with their power and their so-called potential of empowering a person, the potential of growth, the potential of personal growth, collective growth. With all this, despite all this, that innate fear and revulsion to snakes is still prevalent. You would imagine that with all this technology, with all this advancement of knowledge, with all this education and this awareness that has been created about the need for conservation, the need to protect snakes, people still have that very innate fear towards snakes, that revulsion actually. And most of the people who come here to our temple, they, it's very interesting. I've been watching this for the last 20 years. People come, some of them may have killed a snake, or maybe destroyed their eggs, or they may have killed snakes who were mating, or they may have destroyed a habitat of a snake, probably a tree where the snake was dwelling, or probably an entire sacred grove. They would do all that, and then they would come back to atone. So you would think, okay, they are genuinely regretting, that they are regretful of what they have done, and they would like to that they genuinely are trying to make a change. But then you realize it is only, it's very superficial actually, and they do not actually incorporate the spirit of what an act of repentance is. Repenting is when, I mean, nobody is free from sin. You can actually hurt somebody unconsciously, by accident. But then what makes it a little better is that how you think about it, how you approach it, and how sorry you feel for what you have done. Is there a possibility of change from that? Are you growing from that experience? But none of that has been, I have not experienced, or I haven't seen that in people, And something interesting the other day, one of my friends pointed out was this fear of snakes has become so paranoid. Like there is this phobia called Orphidophobia, which is a fear of snakes, and they say it is one of the biggest phobias. The most, at least 10% of the population has this phobia. That's what the experts say. The reactions are so severe, like even panic attacks, or you even faint at the thought or sight or even an image of a snake. So that, with that innate sense of fear inside you, how can you even consider coexisting? Or how can a person even think about coexisting when you have this very innate fear of snakes inside you? And I've always tried to understand that. Even educated people, when I see that, their immediate reaction is at the sight of a snake. I mean, I can understand your most primal instinct when you see a snake. It's not something very easy, or it's not something which you can just overcome with knowledge. It's a very primal instinct to be afraid of snakes. Evolutionary biology, of course, has now a lot of data to substantiate that. But again, even with all these possibilities, I mean, we always try to educate people about the social media is now in Kerala, at least it's become a popular thing for people to rescue snakes. There are a lot of snake rescuers you see on social media who are advertising themselves and requesting people to call them whenever they come across snakes in their homes or backyards or in their farmlands, rather than killing a snake. Despite all these educational pieces of information and all these sources, people still prefer to kill snakes, or rather have them to not encounter them. So this was something which I realized is something much more deeper, and it needs a lot of work, because coexisting, knowing, if you don't see a snake, it's fine. But then when you see a snake and knowing that it is somewhere cohabiting your space, it's not very easy to live with something like that. Because people generally have this feeling that any snake around you is a potential threat. So that is one very interesting observation that I made. And then, so I may sound very cynical and bitter about this whole tradition, but that is not how I am. Though I am a bit disappointed with how people are refusing or unable to see the value of such systems, the potential of finding solutions to all our environmental problems, to issues of diversity that we have, these clashes over various diversities. All these answers are there in our tradition. But despite all that, I am also positive, because my personal experience has been that when you are part of a system like this, it's also very empowering, because there is still a very strong faith system in Kerala. A lot of people are willing to listen to you. You are in a position where you can command attention. People, at least the people who believe in the faith system, are willing to listen to you. And it's a very powerful position. And if used properly, it can have a very significant role in changing the way people think. So sometimes whenever I get an opportunity, I try to explain the significance of these rituals, the importance of living in harmony with nature, with understanding the need for gender equality, for considering the woman, for giving equal importance to a woman in a very patriarchal system. Whenever I get an opportunity, I try to discuss and make people understand. Some are willing, but the majority, unfortunately, are blind and prefer not to or refuse to appreciate the values of these traditions. But for me, I have realized that this is my karma. This is probably my destiny to serve as an ambassador of this ancient, magnificent, and profound tradition, which offers such important lessons about coexistence and living in harmony with nature. So that has been my personal journey with the Sarpa tradition. And I'm very grateful for this experience, because I have grown immensely, not just as a conservation biologist or a person who's concerned about the environment, but also on a deeply personal level. This has been a very empowering journey for me. And I'm glad that I had the opportunity to talk about this and to take a break from life and be able to introspect and try to evaluate and try to see where I was, and also to remind myself about the significance of this life. So thank you so much, and I hope it was useful, and I'm looking forward to any questions or discussions.
Yeah, Namaskar, Nibha ma'am. Thank you very much for this fascinating talk. It is really very, I couldn't even move my head. So I don't want it to miss even one syllable. It was really very fascinating. Thank you so much. And I'm sure I'm echoing the full plenum here. We have a lot of posts, and I want to ask how many time would we have, Nibha, Madam, for the question and answer session to coordinate accordingly.
I'm fine with, I mean, I'm free for some time, so it's okay. I'm okay with answering any questions or encouraging discussions.
Okay, then let's say we have 30 more minutes, and that is a good time to let most of the plenum reactions echo here. So I would like to start with the actual questions. You have also a lot of comments, Nibha, Madam, but I'm starting with the first question from Dr. Sophia. She thanks you, first of all, for this wonderful talk. And then she says, could you please explain how the tradition of Naga worship is mainly passed on from one generation to the next? Question number 1. And then, do grandmothers still tell stories, for example? Or is it the younger generation too much, too much occupied with their mobile phones and television? To what extent is today's younger generation still practicing the rituals? So we have here a couple of questions. Please feel free to just answer selectively or all of them as you wish. So we have a couple of more questions in the plenum, and also thank you for Dr. Sophia for posting it.
So to answer the first question about how this tradition is transferred. So like with most of our traditions, the oral tradition is usually transferred from one generation, from the older members of the family to the younger generation. And that has been the way with most of our traditional societies. And I can tell you in the context of my family, here, of course, the children, because they are born and brought up in such a system, they are very familiar with the traditional aspects as well. And there are certain rituals which are still followed and practiced, and which consists of an initiation into these rituals. And they are taught by their either their parents or any other male member of the family. And it's an orally transcribed form of a exchange or sharing of knowledge. And then about this, there was another question about whether there was tradition of storytelling that still continued with grandmothers. Unfortunately, I think that is kind of declining, because storytelling, at least when I grew up, it was a very strong tradition. I personally was, though I grew up outside Kerala, I was not physically connected with the tradition continuously. However, I had a very strong tradition from both my paternal and maternal side. My grandparents were good storytellers, and we were told stories from the Puranas, and it was taken for granted that you had to know these stories, both the Ramayana and Mahabharata. And my grandmother used to regale stories from the Puranas. And that tradition of storytelling, I find now had a lot of value to it, because that was a wonderful way of transferring certain value systems to the younger generation, through stories. And I think that was exactly why the Puranas were made. There's a very interesting story about the Puranas, which is that when Vedavyasa, the sage who was believed to have composed the Vedas, he was very disappointed at one time after composing the Vedas. The world was still not, people were still getting into trouble. People were still unhappy. There was still not much growth, personal growth actually. So Vedavyasa was very disappointed, and he was advised by Narada to change his style of communicating. I'm just putting it in a very simple language, So Narada advised Vyasa to use a lot more of aesthetics. He said, create something which is fascinating to the people, which is appealing to them, which engages their senses. So he advises Vyasa to compose the Puranas. And that is how these abstract, very esoteric concepts were then kind of like put into small capsules through the Puranas in the form of mythology. They were very aesthetically presented. It was how you present the Puranas was also very important. There was a lot of music, and I think most of our classical art forms evolved as a part of that tradition, because most of our traditional classical art forms narrate stories from the Puranas, and it's a wonderful experience when you it's a wonderful experience to all your senses, and something very significant and very abstract concepts, philosophical concepts, value systems are transcribed to ordinary people in a very aesthetic manner. So this tradition of storytelling and the tradition of communicating stories through performing arts and classical art forms is all declining, unfortunately, in our society. And whether it has affected the younger generation, I am neither here nor there. I'm not completely critical of the younger generation, and nor am I completely happy with the way such knowledge systems are being or not being effectively communicated or being put into practice. So I guess there will always be a community or a group of individuals who will always want to look for answers, who would always want to go back into history, want to understand tradition. So that I'm still very positive about that. However, I mean, and technology in one way has helped in that. Of course, I grew up reading Amar Chitra Katha, which was, they were the legendary, the most popular Harry Potter versions of mythology for us when we were growing up in the 80s and 70s. So I do believe that technology does have a role. The technology can use its tools to communicate the value systems that are part of our traditional systems. So I guess I'm not all that cynical about the younger generation. I hope I have answered.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nibha ma'am. Thank you.
So thank you very much. I would like to continue with Zur raised his hand, and Zur posted, I think, 2 comments. So Zur, if you would just summarize them and ask a question if you have, so that others can also share their thoughts. Thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you so much for the wonderful talk. I actually, the comments are redundant, but I wanted to talk about a couple of things. First, let me share this. Sorry, I can't do that. I wish I could. Anyways, the Western perspective, I guess not perspective, the Western, the way we grow up is to be afraid of snakes. And this goes back to, I think, 2 instances of appearances of snakes in the Old Testimony, what we call the Bible, where all the interesting traits that you attributed to, or some of the interesting traits that you attributed to serpents are told throughout the story. The temptation, the weakness, the smartness, all that stuff. In heaven, when the serpent persuades the woman to bring that apple to eat the apple and also share that with her husband, and they're thrown out of heaven. So this is like for Western, I guess, Christians and Jewish people, it's very apparent. And I have to say that I'm also biased because I had a small snake in a terrarium when I was young, and I was able to play with it, and it was fine. But I wanted to actually, so these were just comments. But I actually wanted to pick on your brain on what I find a controversial approach for preservation, and that includes serpents, but also serpent gardens and the other things that you mentioned. So I find it a little bit problematic when you declare something sacred, and this is why we preserve it, or make sure that it's sustained and has its own habitat and all that. Because, and I understand it's controversial. So declaring something sacred, like the UN declares something, or culture declares something, is I feel the wrong way to pursue preservation in the more general form, as an idea of a preservation of nature and related things, not because it's sacred or anything like that, because it's part of our planet, or that's the other approach. It's part of our planet. It makes good for everybody. It is the right thing to do, rather than attributing sacredness. I hope my point is understood. If not, I can give like a very simple example, which I will refrain if it's understood.
I think I pretty much got your point. During my last talk on elephants and conservation of elephants, I think Dr. Strauss brought up a similar question, which is kind of close to what you've been asking. So what I understand, I'm just clarifying, what you were asking was how on one aspect there is this theoretical or abstract level, academic level of finding something sacred and respecting it, and in practice, it is not being done. That is one. And the other aspect, what I thought you were trying to present was, why is there a need for an aura of sacredness? Isn't ecological facts enough? Isn't that reason enough to preserve something? Is that what you really asked? Am I clear in understanding?
Yes, I'm questioning the method of preservation.
Because I mean, this is something which I have been pondering about for a long time, because I was trained as a biologist, and for me, like you said, you don't need any esoteric or abstract or divine interpretations to preserve something which is so tangible around you. You don't need somebody to tell you that the snake is, or the sacred grove is divine to protect that piece of habitat, because you know why it is important. You know the ecological facts about it, but and also there is an aesthetic side to you. If you are a person who's concerned about, who is a nature lover, obviously it is your most natural instinct to do it. You don't need to worry about if there are laws, or if is there a law that I need to do it? No, this comes very naturally to you. So at two levels, for some people, it is very normal to be following all these principles. Nobody has to come and teach you. Nobody has to come and put certain regulations for you to be able to do that. But that, as I understand, I've been trying to do some understanding, because that's one area of interest that I have, is to understand human nature. Why do we behave in certain ways? Why are some social or human behaviors different from certain other behaviors? And even after when you know the facts, when people are aware of things like global warming and climate change, the impacts are all tangible around you. Why do you still continue to practice certain things, even if you know that is not the right way to do it. There are a lot of reasons for not doing that. I guess one very simple way of looking at it is not everybody in society, people are at different levels of consciousness and understanding. I'm explaining this without any such biases or without trying to present myself or people who think in such a way as an arrogant or more privileged people. But of course, it is true that there are certain people in society have different levels of intelligence, different levels of comprehending certain aspects, certain concepts. So sometimes I guess it is necessary to kind of veil it in a blanket of fear or some kind of a sacredness or divinity. Because this has been also my experience working as an activist and as a conservationist for more than 30 years now, 30 to 35 years now. Because if you tell people the mere facts, if you tell them, okay, you shouldn't be doing this, you should be protecting this patch of land because it has so and so significance, this is important in such a way. You're not supposed to kill a snake, not just because it's non-violent, but also it has a certain place in the ecosystem. It's part of a big chain. And when you continue to kill snakes, it is going to affect the normal functionings of the ecosystem. If you give this kind of a logical, scientific understanding to a person, depending on that person's level of intelligence, their closeness to such subjects, they will probably just ignore it. However you try to explain these things to them scientifically, people still make mistakes. So sometimes fear is the only way in inculcating a sense of fear and a sense of what you call it, the divine or the esoteric will in some way encourage people to not, or discourage people from engaging in certain practices. So I guess that's the most simple way of that, simple explanation that I have for that. So tradition probably had understood this, and this system was deliberately inculcated, all these series of myths and fabrications that were there. Because if you tell somebody, don't step into this place at night because you will be disturbing the nocturnal animals. There are civets, there are bats, there are birds, nocturnal birds who hunt at night. So your presence is going to disturb them. People are not going to listen to that. Instead, if you create a whole fabric of stories around spirits being there and it being dangerous and it being something that there are supernatural elements to this, probably that is one way of controlling some kind of actions with a large group of people. So I hope I have
if I may, I want to be a little bit more even controversial on that. So Anushri asked me something on the chat, and she said there are many ways to do that preservation, higher nature preservation concept. And she says, what's wrong with this one? And the problem that I have with this one is that one community can say serpents are sacred and you're not allowed to touch them, whereas another community can say serpents are to be destroyed. Whereas this is causing an immediate clash. So for me, long-term wise, this is not a right way to go. The right way to go is to educate people about the importance of preserving nature, however smart or non-smart they are. Considering myself a very average person, I can understand. I do bad things to nature. I open the air condition when it's not required, all that stuff. But still, I think if I'm more educated, more tuned into the big goal, it would be better in the long term than using the sacred argument. That's my, yeah, that's the only thing that I'm going to say more today. Sorry about taking so much time.
No, it's fine. I enjoy it, but this can go on, because there are, of course, you are, each of us have our own have our own ideologies about things. And for me, this has been shaped by my experiences of working with conservation in India. And I have been actively working as an ambassador for protecting habitats and species. And time and again, I have come across incidences where we have tried so many such methods, where we have tried education, we have tried awareness building, but particularly in my state in Kerala, I can give you a small example to tell you why I became disillusioned with the conventional educational system, the awareness system as a solution to most of our issues, social issues. Because the premise is that people make mistakes because they are not aware. If you give them facts, if you give them certain data, they will accept it, they will process it, and they will refrain from making those same mistakes or or refrain from that particular action. But for me, my experience has been such that Kerala, especially my state, has been considered to be very progressive in many areas, especially with education. We are a state with almost 99 or 100% literacy, including women and children. And people are quite aware politically, very forward thinking. But in my state, we have been experiencing such heavy environmental issues, such serious environmental issues because considering the geography, the landscape of our land, of our state, it's a very fragile piece of ecosystem. And it cannot take such aggressive, advances of development, such as roads and mining and all that. And we have been working to try to change that. We've been working with the people, and most of the people who we work with, what we call the common man, they're quite aware of what they're doing. They know that. It's not that they're not aware of it. So then what is your possibility of going ahead? How do you, the concept of coexistence, all these concepts of living in harmony with nature, people know that, but they still continue, they choose to make those mistakes. So how do you deal with that? I am more than willing to accept any kind of a proposition, any kind of a theory or possibility that is that anybody can suggest to change the perceptional levels of people, to change their attitudes toward the environment. Why, when it's very obvious to them, because people in Kerala have been faced with very severe floods and landslides for the last 2 years continuously. We've been having severe climate change issues, and it is affecting the lives of a lot of people in Kerala. The social economic fabric of Kerala has been ripped apart. Despite this, people have not changed their ways. People know that. Everybody, I have been working in the field, I've been working with a lot of such people, and they know this. They tell you exactly. They tell you what is wrong, why they're doing this wrong, but then they continue to do it. So how do you stop that? How do you intervene? So I don't have an answer to that. This is just what I have. So I realized, for me, with my experience, I realized that to stop people from doing some things, this probably tradition could be one way. I'm not saying this is the way, but this is, and I don't believe in generalized solutions for each place. It depends on where you are. At least from my experience with Kerala, with working with Kerala and in India, I have realized that this is the most effective and powerful way of changing people's attitudes and making sure that your environment is protected and safe. So I don't think I can debate on you on that, and I don't think I can convince you, but I am very convinced that this is what ultimately works for for our systems here in Kerala.
That's perfect. Thank you so much for your detailed answer. I will ponder on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Tur. We have 1:30 here in India, and I wanted to ask if Dr. Bhavani would have some final thoughts, or Dr. Sid, on today's presentation before we end this session today with a...
I will wait for Dr. Sid to say something, and then I would love to say something at the end, but if Sid has something to say.
Thank you. So Dr. Sid, would you please share your thoughts? Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for a really interesting talk. And I thought that you couldn't outdo yourself when you spoke about the elephants and conservation, etc. And well, I don't know if you did outdo yourself, but it was no less fascinating today than it was before when you gave your presentation. So really hats off to you. So I had all kinds of thoughts, some similar to yours. So it sounds like you're talking about how can you convince people, what is the convincing system that you can use to have people become more harmonious with their environment. And so one way is through the intellect, and you can explain, and you said correctly, I think, that goes only so far. People know they're not supposed to do something at a very personal level for themselves. People know that smoking is very harmful to themselves and other people. So the knowledge is there. Ask anybody and they'll tell you, and they smoke. So there's a difference between the beliefs that people have and the knowledge that they have and how they actually behave. So one place you might want to look about how people's behaviors change is in social psychology. And there are some people, excuse me, and some people have been doing work in that about how can attitudes change. And sometimes they look at racial discrimination, or a whole host of issues that they look at. That's one place where you might look. I'll see if I can dig something up. And if you want, I can send you some information about it. There's a second comment, and that is spiritual understandings for the purpose of changing people's behaviors, as opposed to spiritual understandings because of spiritual understandings. Something where it's not utilitarian. It's a way of understanding yourself and the world, not how to change others, but how to be. That struck me in the conversation that you had with Sur. And the last comment is to the people who are working in villages. And we're trying to do all sorts of things. And my guess is you're talking about things in a philosophical, anthropological, those perspectives. And I was thinking that people who work in the villages, trying to do whatever it is that people are trying to do, if there isn't an understanding, hopefully a deep understanding, of what organizes people's understandings of the world, then whatever it is that we try to do, even if we don't want it to, or even if we don't know that it's going to happen, it's going to get taken into a prism that people have, that organizes how they think about the world, that organizes their emotions about the world. And so it's not that everybody should be an anthropologist when they're working in the villages, but it would be helpful if people could become more keen in understanding what the interventions are that they're doing. I had a brief conversation, maybe not so brief, with Chris Coley yesterday, I think. And we talked about, excuse me, and we talked about Clifford Geertz's work on thick descriptions. And what you talked about, and I'm certain that what you talked about is just, the upper level of what you know, and underlying that are many, many, many layers of knowledge and understanding and feelings as well. So part of what we might try to do is to figure out what those thick descriptions are, and perhaps they can, and here's something which is utilitarian, having that knowledge could be helpful in having people become knowledgeable about whatever it is that's being taught, so they could be gainfully employed, and understanding the place of changes that women undergo with kind of projects that we have, and what that does to the harmony within the village. Anytime you introduce something, the education is exactly that. Education is about changing individuals, but those individuals who change are then changing people who are around them, just like the way you talked about the snakes and a food chain. So if you do something here, it's going to affect what's below it and what's above it. And you should be aware as much as you can about that. I've been talking too much. Thank you really for really interesting understanding about what you're talking about. And it's basically just about fundamental, deep parts of human nature. And if it's in Kerala, or if it's in Tel Aviv, or if it's in Zurich, or other places, there are parts of human understanding that are very deep, and you exposed some of that to us. And for that, I thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Strauss. I couldn't have put it any better. I completely agree and understand what you say.
I'm not able to hear. Is it just me?
I think Sid concluded.
Yeah, I thought Nibha said something after that, and I couldn't hear it, so I was.
No, I just added, I was just thanking Dr. Strauss. I completely agreed with whatever he said. There's nothing more that I can add to what he said. So.
Yeah, and I was also it's like some of his comments were so spot on. And I mean, in some ways what he said is education is also some kind of a belief system. It's based on the knowledge that you have currently in your hand. So it is also some kind of a belief system. But I also was thinking about what Stuart asked, and he made some very interesting points. And I just was, it threw one question in my head, but it also threw a comment. The question is, do we have any kind of a thing from what I understand? Anytime we hold something sacred, it's usually to protect it and preserve it, and it's not to destroy it. But I have not heard or come across that many negative examples, or like something is evil and therefore you need to destroy it. Maybe it is there, I don't know. I just haven't come across it that often, or nothing is really just jumping out at me. So do you know of things like that where we have inadvertently destroyed a certain kind of a species based on some kind of a taboo and things like that? So that was a question that his comment threw to my mind. The second is that there is the comment that I wanted to make is usually, like you said, behavior sticks when you actually associate it with something that is spiritual or meaningful to a person, and therefore that's really the only way. Even when we work in the villages, that is the easiest way to get people to commit to something, or to have that repeated effect where they will do it regularly, as opposed to do something and then forget about it completely. But when it is done without knowledge, then it becomes a superstition, and then it becomes meaningless. So it's just when that knowledge, the ritual is not combined with knowledge. It can be combined with the mystic, but it should also be, and it could be completely grounded in knowledge. But if that knowledge is also not transferred, then it becomes superstitious, and then a very, very superficial and very external aspect of it only then survives, and not the original intention for which it was probably originally created. So this was my comment. So first is the question is there any negative examples that you can think of? And second is the comment is on when it becomes a meaningless superstition.
If that's a question for me, then I think that I can come up with a couple of
No, it
examples.
was a question to Nibha, but that was more from the Indian tradition. I was thinking, I'm sure that there is like about snakes. I know that it's there for the Western tradition. I was just thinking about the Indian tradition, whether there is anything like that. If you know of an example from the Indian tradition, happy as I was asking her if she knows any. But if you know anything from the Indian tradition, yeah, it's just nothing that I can come up off the top of my head. That's all.
So, to answer your first question about
Very low, and I'm not quite sure. It happened once or twice in between.
Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? Hello?
Yeah, better, much better.
Okay. Yeah, so to answer your first question about any negative examples, if I knew of any negative examples, like you said, I can't think of anything on the top of my head, because most of these so-called sacred blankets all had a positive, at least the spirit of it was quite positive, and with the larger good in mind. But however, like you, there's another side to it, when how a knowledge becomes a superstition, that I have seen quite a bit. Actually, one example that I can tell you right off my head is with the association with elephants, especially elephants in captivity. On one side, there is this very sacred kind of a sacredness about elephants. They're associated with Ganesha, and part of a lot of our rituals, and at least in Kerala, they're part of many of our temple traditions. But in reality, what is being practiced is something so abhorrent, and it's something completely that goes against this principle of sacredness. Because in reality, the kind of life, the kind of abuse that captive elephant community is experiencing, happening to them, the kind of treatment that is meted out to them is completely violent. So and I'm sure there are many such examples of how certain traditions have been, their essence has been lost and have become completely opposite in practice. So I guess that is something that I can respond to your first question. And your second question about superstition and knowledge becoming any kind of a fact becoming meaningless without the knowledge system. Is that what you asked? Was that your question?
It was just a comment. It was a comment saying that if we have certain kind of rituals or something where you don't understand why you're doing what you're doing, then it just becomes meaningless. At some point, it becomes useless even, or even dangerous.
Yeah, because I living through this for the last 20, 30 years, because I've always been a person who believes in democracy, and I believe there is a right, everybody has a right to knowledge, and knowledge should be accessible to everyone. And but the thing is, on one side, you speak about the need to communicate certain information. Then, because to me, I can't imagine doing something without understanding why I'm doing it, and I have to know what value it holds for me, what value it, what impacts it has to the environment around me. If it is impacting the lives of others, the lives of, or if it's impacting the system around me, I would like to know, and I would like to be responsible for that action. And for me, that knowledge is very important. So, but I have from my experience with working very close with the community, and also my association, my involvement with social change at various levels, I have realized that sometimes not everybody really wishes to have that kind of knowledge. It's like sometimes I have, from my personal experience, I have tried to explain things to people, try to explain the logic behind certain rituals, or why certain things should be done in a certain way, or why certain things shouldn't be done in a certain way, or why you shouldn't have certain attitudes and why you shouldn't. And most of the time, sometimes people respond positively. They say, oh, okay, I didn't realize that this was the reason for why we did this, or this has a certain impact like this, or this affects so and so parameters or factors around me. Some people have responded like that, but there are others who basically are not interested. You know, they're like, it's just too much information for me, just going over my head. Just give me, I would just do this because this is what I'm comfortable just following orders. You know, this is something which has been followed by my ancestors. I'm going to do this. So it is a choice, I believe. My experience has taught me that this is a conscious choice. Of course, always when we talk about democratic systems, when people are given, when you believe that a democracy allows people to make choices, but there's always this thing about informed choice. When you make a choice, you have an information to back you. Like, on what basis are you making a decision, or on what basis are you making a choice? But some people just, it doesn't matter to them. Even if you are willing to offer, they prefer to ignore it, and they would rather just follow things and get it done with than go into the what they call it as the labor of processing information. So I think this also ties to Zood's earlier question about, or his comment about the need for making information available to people and allowing them to make choices based on that. So I don't know if I have actually connected to your question or your comments.
Yes, yes, very much so. Thank you so much. That was perfect. And I just also want to ask Sur if he would share with us what example he has of a negative thing, if that's okay, just to see what was on his mind, because he does have something very concrete on his mind, if that's okay.
Right. So the first thing that came to my mind was that it's not in nature in a sense, but it's a sacred places that were recently, maybe 4 or 5 years ago in Iraq, and that area were demolished completely just because they are sacred to the other community.
You mean the Bamiyan statues? That was in Afghanistan, right?
Among others, yes. Many churches, many places of worship, many old cultural assets.
Yeah, I think though that what Nibha was trying to say is a little different. It's this. I think this is what, when she talks about something, and Nibha, please correct me, that my understanding that this is more in connection with habits and actions that are really associated with natural resources and nature and the environment around us, and that would somehow bring about a more harmonious coexistence. This thing. Again, I'm going to make a comment. Again, it's not substantiated by science, but it's just a comment. Considering that India has probably been one of the most populated and the most densely populated places in the entire world for millennia, so it's hundreds and thousands of years. The fact that we still manage to have the amount of environment we have is probably because of some of these very hardwired rituals. Like, for example, you do not eat meat more than once a week. Almost every other day, there's some reason not to eat meat, or there's some reason not to eat rice every single day. So the way that these things were hard coded and like you at one point of time, I think pre-independence, if you went back 50 years before into pre-independence, these things were very, very rigidly followed across all castes and all sections of society. And I think that's probably why we have even whatever little bit we have of things left. And I think we would not even have this much were it not for those processes in place. And I think over time, of course, it just definitely degraded in a very big way. But even if it degraded, the fact that you are not allowed to touch plants after dark, period. It's just that it's like those things when they're hardwired in your head as a child, you just don't do it. Like, I know I was told as a child, like, do not touch plants after sundown because they're sleeping. It's like somebody pinching your ear once you've gone to sleep. And that just never left my mind till now. I will not touch a plant or walk on grass after sundown because they're sleeping. I mean, it's small things like that. They just like if they say, no, if you tell a lie, your nose grows longer, kind of thing. I don't know how much of a deterrent that is, but I'm just saying that some of these things really stay with you for God only knows what reasons that they stay with you. So when used in the positive way, like she said, I think the impact is going to be quite strong. But then again, I think the conversation was really about natural resources and our relationship with the environment, and not necessarily religious. I don't know. Not just. Please jump in, Nibha, if I'm just trying to speak for you over here. I'm sorry.
Yeah, of course, Dr. Rao, what you said, I was speaking in terms of natural resources. Because that has been my forte, that has been my area of work, my focal area of interaction with the community. And this whole concept of sacred grove today, it all, I was more, I am, and I was always, I have been interested in the ecological value of these traditions. So I was talking in that context, and just to add on to substantial Dr. Rao's comments with some examples, because where we live now in Kerala, this place where I am, we still have little patches of forests, with even though it's just 5 the just an acre of land. Otherwise, because is very much into real estate now. Almost, though we have a very small piece of land, very scary. And, for people for a very long time, large projects, developments being pushed by the government, and how do you face that onslaught? And I'm sorry, I seem to have some problem with my signals here. Yeah, so just to tell you that this is happening on a day-to-day basis. We have real estate agents who come to us requesting us to do certain rituals so that a certain portion of the sacred grove would become commercially, it would be commercially, because people, since we represent the community which ordains these rituals or sanctions these rituals, they come to us asking our permission to convert a piece of sacred grove to real estate. And very often that is the only reason which keeps them from taking over the complete landscape. Otherwise, whatever little greenery and whatever little ecosystem that we have left would have been lost to development or whatever quite early. So I think that is a blessing in disguise, though a lot of people may not agree to it, but this seems to be the method that seems to be working in our place.
Okay, thank you very much, ma'am, for this answer. Also, I have read that Dr. Bhavani needs to log out. She needs to go into the field. And she also asked you if you could kindly share maybe the slides or slides which you would like to share, a selected version maybe, with us so that we can maybe see also the pictures of the rituals, if possible for you. And I would need to log out as well to my next meeting, but I feel that a lot of participants have questions, and maybe if Chris Coley would be okay to take over the moderation of the question answer part, I would leave. Is that okay?
Unfortunately, I also have a meeting at 2 o'clock. I have to leave for. So.
Okay. So then let us end today's session. It's really wonderful. It was wonderful to hear you all, the comments as well. And Kripa, if you are online, maybe you can share the chat comments also with Nibha ma'am, so that she can read it and get also the echo shared. So it was really very wonderful. Maybe we can also activate our video so that Nibha ma'am can also see who is the person who asked the question, so it's more personal as well for her. And yeah, having said that, tons of thanks again, and hopefully we will see each other soon. And we wish you a wonderful day, and we consider you already as part of our AMMACHI Labs. So thank you very much again for your efforts and the time you have shared, and the wisdom and the knowledge. So I think Nibha ma'am has still connectivity issues. I hope she had heard the last words, and yeah, I think we can log out now, and let us end today's session. Or Nibha ma'am, are you online?
Thank you so much, everybody. Okay. It was a wonderfully fascinating session. Yeah, and I know this is a topic that's exhaustive. You can keep talking about it. I hope at some point, at some time, we will have an opportunity to have a more elaborate discussion, if possible. Thank you so much. I thoroughly enjoyed interacting with all of you.
Thank you very much. Namah Shivaya. All the best. Namaskaram.
Namah Shivaya. Bye.